In the biting winter of 1883, when the snow drifted deep and the winds howled like wolves across the plains, Jacob Stoltzfus, an Amish farmer, set out to prove that warmth could be more than just a fleeting comfort. His crazy stove, crafted with careful hands and a stubborn heart, would defy the very nature of winter. But what seemed like an eccentric idea would soon become the difference between life and death for him and his neighbors. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from. If stories of craftsmanship, resilience, and quiet faith speak to your heart, stay with us for tomorrow's tale. You might just find warmth in unexpected places. Jacob Stoltzfus knelt beside the hearth, the weight of the Amish community's eyes heavy on his back. He had never been one to seek the approval of others, but today felt different. His hands, weathered by years of working the land, gently placed the final log into the stove he had spent months building with his own two hands. The stove was an oddity, a creation no one had ever seen before in their simple Amish settlement. The walls of his house were thick and well built, as were most Amish homes, but Jacob knew the true battle of winter wasn't fought just against the cold, it was against the unpredictability of it. The fire would only last so long, and no matter how much wood he fed it, there would still be moments when the frigid air crept in, testing his family's survival. He had spent weeks, more time than anyone thought reasonable, crafting the stove. Every piece of brick, every twist of the metal pipe that ran through the chimney had been carefully placed. He remembered the mocking glances from his neighbors when they had first heard of his plan. A stove made from bricks, metal, and fireclay? Was it worth the time and cost? To most, it seemed extravagant, wasteful even, in a world where simplicity was key. But Jacob had known something they did not. Winter wasn't a season you could simply wait out. It was an adversary to be understood and defeated. He'd worked on stoves before, repairing broken ones in the homes of friends, but none had ever kept the warmth for long. He had noticed how quickly the heat escaped through the walls, no matter how thick they were, and it had nagged at him. There had to be a way to make heat stick, to make it last. So, with the patience instilled in him by years of farming and craftsmanship, Jacob had designed a stove that could trap the warmth inside the house, keeping it steady for hours, even through the coldest nights. Now, as he stirred the fire and watched the embers glow brighter, he knew the test had begun. The storm was coming, a hard one, the kind that would take more than a handful of firewood to survive. His wife, Miriam, stood in the doorway, her breath a soft fog in the cold air. "Is it ready?" she asked, her voice full of quiet concern. "It's ready," Jacob replied, though the uncertainty in his own voice echoed louder than he wanted. Miriam nodded but didn't smile. She was used to Jacob's quiet resolve, but even she couldn't deny the risks involved. They had enough wood to last the week, but the coming storm threatened to stretch that beyond its limit. It had been a harsh year already, with their crops yielding less than expected, and the winter ahead promised nothing but difficulty. The weather had already shown its teeth. This stove was more than just an innovation, it was their shield, if it worked. The wind picked up on the evening of December 12th, rattling the window panes as if the earth itself was shivering. By nightfall, the snow had begun to fall, first lightly, like a soft promise, but soon it grew heavy, filling the air with a thick blanket of white. The air turned bitterly cold as the storm gained strength, and Jacob could feel it in his bones. It was the kind of storm that had no mercy, the sort that could freeze livestock in the open fields and leave a person stranded without shelter. Inside, the fire in the stove burned steadily, its warmth filling the room. Jacob sat beside the hearth, watching the flames with quiet satisfaction. It was everything he had hoped for. The heat seemed to radiate evenly from the stove, not escaping through the walls like it would in a regular fireplace. The stove had been designed to circulate the heat, keeping the temperature stable. Miriam, who had been sewing by the light of a small lantern, looked up from her work, her eyes tired but relieved. "It's warmer than I thought it would be," she said softly, her tone almost reverent. Jacob nodded, but the silence between them was thick with unspoken thoughts. He had heard the concerns of their neighbors, who had warned him not to waste money on such extravagant projects. And yet, here he was, in his warm home, with the wind howling outside and the snow piling up against the windows. There was no telling how long the storm would last, but, at least they were safe, at least for now. Outside, the world was transforming. The snow piled higher and higher, and the wind blew with such force that the trees bent under its pressure. Jacob stood up, walking to the window and staring out into the storm. It was coming harder now, the kind of blizzard that could swallow entire towns, the kind that killed without mercy. "I've got to check on the livestock," he said, turning toward Miriam. She looked at him, concern written on her face. "Don't be long, Jacob. The storm's only going to get worse." He kissed her cheek and pulled on his heavy coat. The door groaned as he opened it, and the wind blasted him in the face, biting through the layers of his clothing. As Jacob walked toward the barn, he could feel the strength of the storm growing. It was as if the earth had tilted, and the storm was determined to swallow them whole. He knew, though, that his home would remain steadfast. The stove would keep them warm no matter what. But even as he moved toward the barn, a quiet voice in his mind whispered the truth. This storm was only a glimpse of the dangers yet to come. The test was just beginning. The storm raged for 3 days straight. Jacob's feet felt heavy with each step, as if the snow itself sought to pull him into the earth. The wind bit through his coat, stinging his face and freezing his breath mid-air. It was the kind of winter storm that would have turned a lesser man back, but not Jacob. He pushed on, his mind focused on the well-being of his livestock. Back at the cabin, Miriam sat by the stove, her hands busy with the sewing that had come to occupy her evenings. She knew that while Jacob worked outside, she too had a job to do to keep their home warm and their spirits steady. The stove had held up, just as Jacob had hoped. The warmth was constant, the heat spreading evenly through the small cabin. It was a far cry from the frigid air they would have endured if not for Jacob's work. But as the storm grew fiercer, Miriam's thoughts wandered. She could hear the wind outside and feel the ground shake beneath their feet. The thought of Jacob out there battling the storm made her chest tighten with worry. She prayed quietly, the words of her faith wrapped around her like a comforting blanket. Jacob reached the barn door, and the wind almost tore it from its hinges as he struggled to open it. Inside, the animals were restless. The cold had crept in despite his efforts to insulate, and the snow had begun to seep through the cracks in the walls. The cattle huddled together, their breath hanging thick in the air. He moved swiftly, checking the water troughs and feeding the animals. He had built this barn strong, but it wasn't meant to withstand a storm of this magnitude. Still, he trusted in the land. His family had been on this land for generations, and they had always found a way through the worst winters. But as he moved between the stalls, the wind howled through the cracks, and Jacob could hear the unmistakable sound of the roof shifting under the weight of the snow. His heart clenched. If the roof gave way, they'd lose everything. He hadn't built it to withstand the pressure of so much snow. He had built it to endure the winters of the past, not this one. Panic began to rise within him, but he forced it down. There was no time for fear. He had to act. With a sense of urgency, Jacob worked quickly, bracing the barn's roof with any material he could find. He knew it wasn't enough to save it completely, but it might buy them some time. Finally, after hours of effort, he retreated back to the cabin, exhausted and covered in snow. The storm had not let up, and he could barely see beyond a few feet in front of him. As he entered the warm cabin, Miriam looked up, relief flooding her features as she took in the sight of him, covered in snow but safe. He closed the door behind him with a soft thud, the noise of the storm muffled instantly by the thick walls of the house. He collapsed into the chair beside the stove, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "The barn?" Miriam asked, her voice laced with concern. "I've done what I could," Jacob replied, pulling his gloves off and warming his hands by the stove. "We'll have to wait and see." He glanced at the stove, the flames dancing behind the glass. It was a comfort, a reassurance in the midst of the chaos outside. But even as he sat there, warmth spreading through his bones, he knew it wouldn't be enough to stop the storm. No matter how well his stove worked, nature still had the final say. The days blended together in a haze of snow, ice, and bitter cold. The storm had not let up. By the time the fourth day arrived, Jacob's concerns about the barn had deepened. The roof had held, but only just. Every hour the storm raged outside, it felt as if they were slowly losing the battle. His neighbors hadn't fared much better. A few had already sent their families to the town for shelter. unable to endure the unrelenting cold. Jacob and Miriam had long stopped worrying about the things they couldn't control. They focused on what they could, keeping the stove stoked, keeping the fire warm, and ensuring they had enough food and water to last until the storm broke. But as the days wore on, Jacob's thoughts began to turn darker. The storm was relentless, and they were running low on firewood. The idea of leaving the cabin and making the dangerous trek into town seemed foolish, but the thought of running out of warmth was worse. The cold would freeze them long before the hunger could touch them. Yet even as he considered these things, he kept coming back to the stove. It had been a source of comfort, and Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that it might be their only chance. On the morning of the 5th day, the winds finally began to die down. The snow was still falling, but the storm's intensity had decreased. Jacob and Miriam took a brief respite from the constant work of tending the stove. Miriam spent time in prayer, her quiet words drifting into the silence of the cabin. She prayed for strength, for patience, for survival, and for her husband's wisdom in the face of such overwhelming odds. Jacob, for his part, stood in the center of the room, his gaze fixed on the stove. The fire had burned low, but it still offered warmth and hope. "I think it's time," he said quietly, almost to himself. "What is?" Miriam asked, looking up from her place by the window where she had been watching the falling snow. "I'm going out to check on the animals," Jacob said. "I have to know if the barn is still standing." He was silent for a moment before adding, "We've come this far, we can't give up now." Miriam nodded, understanding without words the weight of his decision. Jacob had always been the one to shoulder the burden of their survival, and she had always trusted his instincts. But she also knew that survival wasn't always about strength. Sometimes it was about faith. She squeezed his hand before he left the warmth of the cabin, a silent prayer of her own on her lips. The barn was still standing. Against all odds, it had weathered the storm. The roof, though heavily strained, had not given way. Jacob breathed a sigh of relief as he checked the livestock. The animals were cold but alive, their breathing slow but steady. In the distance, the storm clouds began to break apart, revealing patches of blue sky. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time in days, Jacob allowed himself to believe they might just make it through. He returned to the cabin, where Miriam awaited him, her face lit by the glow of the stove. He smiled, exhaustion etched on his features, but there was something else there too, a quiet triumph. "It held," he said simply. And in that moment, Jacob realized that he had done more than build a stove. He had built something that would endure, something that would carry them through the worst the world could throw at them. And in the end, that was what mattered most. Faith, resilience, and patience had brought them through the storm, and those same virtues would carry them through whatever lay ahead. By the time the storm finally lifted, the land was unrecognizable. Snowdrifts as high as the windows had transformed the world outside into a frozen wilderness. The sky had cleared, revealing a pale, cold light that cast long shadows over the homestead. It had been days since Jacob and Miriam had ventured outside, but as the wind settled, they knew the worst was over. Jacob stood by the window, looking out over the snow-covered fields. His face, drawn and tired, softened as he watched the sun slowly begin to rise higher. The storm had tested them in ways they hadn't imagined, but they had made it through. They were alive, their shelter intact, and for that he was thankful. Miriam joined him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. They didn't need words. They had survived, together. "I knew it would work," Jacob said quietly, his voice thick with relief. He turned to her, a small, tired smile on his lips. "I just had to believe." "And we did," Miriam replied, her eyes bright with gratitude. She glanced over at the stove, which had kept them warm through it all. It had been Jacob's labor of faith, and now it stood as a symbol of his quiet strength. In the days that followed, the neighbors came, one by one, to check on Jacob and Miriam. Word had spread about the crazy stove that had defied the storm, and others came to learn from Jacob's invention. His patience had paid off. Spring would come eventually, melting the snow and bringing new life to the land. But for now, Jacob felt a deep peace. He had built not just a stove, but a life that had withstood the harshest test nature could offer. And in the silence of the cabin, he knew that it was enough.